The Russians have shown that their tactics involve trying to terrorize the Ukrainian population by attacking civilians. This is not a surprise. This is the Russian way of war. They don't go after military targets. They go after civilian targets because they're not winning on the battlefield. They go after grain. They go after Ukraine's ability to export grain, which hurts African and Middle Eastern countries that need it. And they just try to terrorize civilians. So this is Putin's war, and it's an ugly war, and we need to realize that this is not a one-off. This is their policy. This is their way of conducting this war.
Because this town was very close to the front line, but do you think that the Russian forces deliberately targeted this civilian target?
I can't speak to this particular target, but the pattern of Russian attacks on civilian targets is so extensive and so consistent that the assumption has to be that, yes, they are targeting civilians deliberately.
And this came, of course, as Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, is in Kyiv for talks about the progress of the war. How important is the continuing support of the United States to Ukraine, do you think?
Well, it's critical. Without the support of the United States and other allies like the UK, like Poland, like Germany, and other countries, the Ukrainians could not make a fight of it. That support is important, and it's important that Blinken go to Kyiv, not just to show American support, but also to consult with the Ukrainian government about the way ahead. We can't do this. The U.S. and Ukraine cannot have these discussions through tweets and press conferences on both sides. They need to have serious discussions about the way the war is going and the different decisions that the Ukrainians and the Americans may have to make. We all hope that the Ukrainian offensive succeeds, and it has a good chance of succeeding. But just because we want it to succeed doesn't mean it will. So the discussions have to cover the range of options and how we help Ukraine come out of this a winner.
And this highly anticipated offensive has had only limited success from Ukraine's point of view, hasn't it? I mean, there have been some breakthroughs, but not hugely significant ones. Do you think that there is perhaps some frustration amongst the United States and some of its allies that there hasn't been a really significant change in that front line?
I think there was hope, and I think that hope may have been exaggerated, that the Ukrainians would sweep ahead in their offensive the way they did last year around Kharkiv, where they just rolled over the Russians and had colossal breakthroughs very quickly. Now it's much more of a slog. I think expectations were too great. I think that was followed by a sense of disappointment, and you saw that in some of the leaks coming out of Washington about, various downbeat U.S. assessments. But more recently, the Ukrainian advances seem to have picked up. And it's important to remember that the Ukrainians don't need to drive the Russians completely out of Ukraine to have a strategic success. What they need to do, and what they may well do, is advance far enough to put the Russian forces in Crimea under the gun, within long-range artillery and long-range rocket range. If they do that, the Russian position in Crimea may not be tenable, it may not be sustainable, and at that point, Ukraine will have essentially won the war. That is possible. I'm not saying it's inevitable, but the Ukrainians are not fighting a fool's battle. It's not crazy to think that they can advance and succeed. It is a reasonable possibility, and the fact is the U.S., the UK, Poland, Germany, all of Ukraine's friends can put our thumb on the scale and help the Ukrainians by giving them weapons. And I think that Tony Blinken, who understands this very well, I've known Tony Blinken for almost 30 years. He gets this, and I think he's going to be both a serious interlocutor for the Ukrainians, but also a sympathetic one. Tony Blinken understands the the Ukrainians' cause. And frankly, in this part of Europe, and I'm speaking to you from Prague, Tony Blinken is known as a friend, somebody who is on their side. So I think he's exactly the right person to go to Kyiv at this point and have serious discussions about the way ahead.
And we have seen Ukraine increasingly taking the fight to Russia itself. These drone attacks in Moscow, the attacks on Russian ships down in the Black Sea ports. Is there a risk that new tactic, taking the fight beyond Ukraine's own borders, could perhaps undermine some of the Western support that Ukraine enjoys?
Oh, I don't think so at all. I think anybody in the West who thinks the Ukrainians are being so, quote, escalatory by attacking Russia is not thinking clearly. The Russians are attacking all of Ukraine. They are attacking civilian targets. The Ukrainians now are showing the Russians that the war can come home to them as well. I have been impressed by the increasing sophistication of the Ukrainian attacks. At first, these appeared to be merely symbolic. Now they appear to have a strategic dimension. The Ukrainian ability to conduct these attacks, their ability to produce drones and more sophisticated drones seems to be growing. I think this is an important point for the Russians. They are not able to attack all of Ukraine with impunity. The Ukrainians can strike back. I think that is a significant factor, along with the Ukrainian offensive, that may turn the tide of the war. May. I'm not saying will. Victory is not inevitable for the Ukrainians, but it is possible. And I think what you said about the increasing Ukrainian attacks on Russian military targets is a factor in this.
You mentioned there that Antony Blinken, in particular the US Secretary of State, is seen as a friend of Ukraine. How much concern do you think there is in Ukraine and indeed those countries like Poland, which are very close to the conflict, about the possibility of a Republican president in the White House next year, the possibility that Donald Trump could return to power with perhaps a very, very different attitude towards the war?
Well, it's not just the Ukrainians. It is the Poles. It's the Baltics. I'm in Prague, and the Czechs. 140 million Europeans from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea count on America and the Western Alliance, of which America is the leader, but not the only, hardly the only country. They're worried about the isolationist trend in the Republican Party that Trump represents. They know in their bones that the last time the so-called isolationists were powerful in America, the result was catastrophic for Europe, for Britain, for America, because we were passive and disengaged when the Nazis were beginning to overrun Europe, a disaster, and that's on us. They are aware of this, and they're worried about it, but they also have enormous faith in America's ability to keep coming back to its, let's say, its better angels and its best instincts. But this is on people's minds, absolutely.